Hello and welcome to the Health Hub, episode 7. My name's Gary Borman. I'm a qualified naturopath, nutritionist and herbalist, as per the shirt. I've been in clinical practice now for a little bit over 14 years. So the whole idea of the Health Hub is to share some real advice on what's going around, what's hype in the media and some of the stories of interest, just so that we might make the lives of yourselves and some loved ones just that little bit better. To start the show, as we always do, have to read my disclaimer. The following segment should be considered as information, education and entertainment only. It is not designed to replace professional, individualised recommendations and does not infer ceasing prescription medications. If the information presented here causes concerns about your current health regime, discuss these concerns with the prescribing clinician or a qualified healthcare practitioner in a proper clinical environment. And what that means for you is that that's not with the friend over the back fence. It's also not down at your local health food store, because they just tend not to be equipped to be able to go through diet, lifestyle, drug regimes and all the other nutrients and drugs that you are on and potential interactions. And most definitely not with someone who's just taken on their multi-level marketing new product because it's fantastic. Just ask me. That will be coming up in a couple of weeks. One of those companies has actually been fined quite heavily for misleading information, and that's scary stuff because you can hurt yourself. Coming up in this week, we've got Health in Australia, the best that money can buy. How in just 1 week of unhealthy eating can actually damage the brain. Diabetes drugs that might help with weight loss. And gluten intolerance is a fact, a fad, or fiction. Okay, this week the program is being brought to you by MyActive, our friends here. The latest and greatest product on the market as far as arthritic pain goes, and we'll talk a little bit about that after a couple of stories. So the first one, healthcare in Australia. Is it the best that money can buy? Well, Australia has quite an amazing healthcare system. There might be plenty of people who are unhappy with it, but we do have quite an incredible structure here. There is so much for free. We tend to have more than our fair share of incredibly skilled surgeons who take their skills to the world, and researchers that develop new products and take that to the worldwide market as well. We also have a thing called the PBS, the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme, and well, some people at the PBS would say it's the envy of other countries, but it is something that makes it a lot easier to get drugs available to the greater public. One of the examples that I'll give is a drug called Prozac. Most people have heard of it, by a company called Eli Lilly. And in the US, 30 milligrams capsules cost $520 US. And with our dollar not being so flash, we're at 67 cents, let's say, well, that's a lot more for us. And that's from the site drugs.com. In Australia, under the PBS, it is $22.22, and that's according to the PBS website. So that sort of gap is huge. You know, it's not just 500 bucks, that's 500 bucks US is the gap. And yeah, us as taxpayers are making that gap. So have you ever wondered how different drugs get on the PBS? Well, here's where it gets interesting. The Pharmaceutical Guild donated $770,000 to political parties at the last election. Nearly $1 million. And that made it the 14th largest political donator at the last election. And by the way, this is the biggest amount that they had ever given to political parties as a donation. Well, you might ask, why so much for the last one? It's because every 5 years there is a renegotiation of what drugs are in there and how they're going to be supplied. Personally, I don't know if there's much of any other option outside of pharmacies. But yeah, the value of the last 5-year period was $18.9 billion. So divide that by 4 if we round it up. So that's about $4 billion every year. So that's pretty good coin. So there is a lot of financial interest in keeping this thing working, and the pharmaceutical companies are the ones that have got the big financial interest. because just remember, it's cheap for us to buy, but someone still has to pay. The pharmaceutical companies are not missing out. They're not nice guys in subsidising their drugs for us Australians. An interesting quote from the head of the Pharmacy Guild, Mr. George Tambassis. They spelled his name wrong. George, we'll call him. He said that the Guild, to quote, wanted an express commitment that where during the term of the 7th agreement the Australian government proposes a health-related reform that may impact community pharmacy, any decision to proceed must be with written consent of the Guild. So if there's going to be any changes that's going to hurt their bottom line, they're not standing for it. That's how you read through that very jumbly worded sentence. And interestingly, that sort of goes in line with last week's story where we were talking about pharmacies are going to be able to prescribe antibiotics for urinary tract infections in Queensland, coming right about by the time you see this. It's a trial, and it is at the concern of the FRAGP, the Fellow of Registers of the Australian General Practitioners. They're pretty well against it, and we covered that. I thought it sounded pretty good, but then where they tried it in other places, it just amounted to a massive over-prescribing of antibiotics, and that's not a good thing. If that does indeed happen, what makes it interesting is that there was a study by Dr. Stephen Duckett at the Grattan Institute who concluded that Australia was paying $500 million a year too much for medications. He said Australians on average pay 5 times the best international price for a group of 7 commonly prescribed drugs. So when there's $4 billion a year, 500 million, it's only an 8, that's not real big. This is just profit going to those drug companies. So that's the reason why so much money went to the political parties at the last election, and when you read where they distribute it, the party that looked like they were going to get in, they got the lion's share of that, to which the article sort of went, well, that was a bit of a bad investment. As they say, things that make you go, Well, the question is this sustainable? We have this sensational system with free everything and subsidised stuff, but we've got an ageing population, we've got less and less taxpayers because automation, jobs going overseas, etc., and a ballooning health budget. They're actually saying that that 18.9 billion looks like it'll be more like 20 billion over the next 5 years with the next round of agreements. That's just staggering amounts of money. Can we keep it up? Who knows? But probably the real kicker with this one is, are we living any better? We seem to have a community of people that are getting sicker, people on more prescription drugs, more overweight problems, more surgeries required. Is it a model that's going to work? Do we actually have the best system money can buy? Well, best that drug companies can buy. Did you know? Just 1 week of unhealthy eating could damage the part of the brain that normally stops us from eating more when we're full. This was a really interesting study. Came out of using some undergrad students at Macquarie University. They found that people who had an abundance of fast food and high-fat milkshake had increased cravings for more in as little as 7 days, which was pretty astounding. It's not that hard to have a bad diet for a short period of time. They also performed cognitive tests and found that people that were on these really bad diets tended to actually do worse, again, in as little as 7 days. So how they went about these tests, they had 2 groups. One group had a daily diet that started off with waffles and a main meal, a dessert and a drink from a popular fast food restaurant that they gave them the money for, which amounted to about 4,000 calories. So that's a pretty large amount. The other one, they were still given not what I'd call the ideal diet, a breakfast of a toasted sandwich and a low-fat milkshake with no extra sugar. Yeah, they did this for only a week, and after that they had people rating their desire or needs, for a better term, for sugary meals. They found that in that 7 days, the ones that were on the high junkie diet, on the McDiet, actually had much higher scores in their desire for more food and more of the sweet sort of stuff. And this goes along with a study from the Royal Society's Journal of Open Science. They did a test on rats and found that rats that were fed a high-fat diet, containing 25% sugar, were actually thrown into a state of anxiety when that sugar was removed from their diet. And this is why they talk about sugar being so addictive. It's actually quite a nasty drug. There have been plenty of studies that have shown that there is more neural activity with sugar in the brain, one showed with cocaine. So we see lots of activity in the brain centres when people are having sugar, and that's one of the things. We do get very addicted to it. The brain does love glucose, so we do tend to want a lot of it, and under stress we'll often go looking for it. Some of the thoughts behind it, they postulated potentially this could be because of cakes and old memories and stuff like that. And I'd actually go along with this to a degree. You know, the stereotypical in American shows, broke up with the boyfriend, got to eat the quart of chocolate ripple ice cream. But maybe it is a little bit deeper than that. Whenever we were growing up, you'd find that birthday parties, celebrations tended to have an abundance of sweet foods, and that could be cakes, pavlovas, desserts, etc. Did we start building these subconscious pathways that where we have high sugary and sweet foods, it is in relation to celebration and happy times? And for some of us, as we get older, that might have been better times as we look back, when you go through the problems of breakups and heartbreak, etc. So I think there is probably a little bit more to it, that we actually have a psychological attachment as well as a physical attachment and enhancing that brain activity. So really interesting stuff, but in 7 days, doesn't take too long to get too addicted to the old crappy food. Hello, teenagers. Alright, as I said earlier, this week's program is brought to us by MyActive. Our friends at MyActive, probably one of the greatest products I've ever come across as far as helping with arthritis and joint pain. The safety profile is second to none. It interacts with no prescription medications that I can come across, which means this is good to be used concomitantly or in conjunction with any drug regime that you might be on, and you won't be hurting yourself. And that's probably one of the biggest things, is the outstanding safety profile. But I thought I'd share with you my story on MyActive. In the very early days of it, I was out having a good job, ran a personal best time for a K, which I was pretty chuffed about, but pulled up a little bit sore in the knee. The next day I was a lot sorer in one knee, and the day after that it just wasn't letting up. It was throbbing 24 hours a day. My suspicion was some injury, went down to a doc, we got an MRI, and yes, it was a torn meniscus. So no fun at all for someone who's 50. You might have heard torn meniscuses, they're the stuff that, the season-ending injuries for a lot of athletes, football players, stuff like that. I went on to MyActive, I was taking 2 a day, and within 30 days I was running on it pain-free. I continue to take MyActive for all the other health benefits I believe that it can deliver, and I am still pain-free. I have no problems with my knees whatsoever. So quite an outstanding product. So if you know someone who's got arthritis, joint pains, etc., it's well worth trying MyActive and just seeing if they can get results. But if it's tendonitis, it doesn't work. It is arthritis and torn meniscuses where it is sensational. So that was MyActive, MyActiv.com. Get yourself some. Say goodbye to your pain. Timer's not working. Alrighty. Diabetes drugs that might help with weight loss. This was an interesting one that came across my desk. The Journal of Childhood Obesity. You know, it's a crying shame that there's actually a journal for childhood obesity, that it is that bad in the community. They published a story saying that the diabetes drug metformin may help with overweight or obese children. The article was entitled "Metformin Therapy Reduces Obesity Indices in Children and Adolescents." So they came up with this data from 38 research papers where they were looking at the relationship between metformin and how it might reduce body fat. To quote, overall they found significant reductions in body mass index, body weight, waist circumference and fat mass, but not in lean body mass. However, the reductions in BMI and waist circumference were not significant in the youngsters who are overweight or obese. That sounds to me like a pretty serious contradiction in what the facts have been observed, and if it's supposed to help overweight and obese children, and they're finding no clinical significance, I'm not really seeing the benefit in taking metformin, because there is not a person on this planet who has a deficiency of metformin. Metformin is one of the first go-to drugs for type 2 diabetes, actually based on goat's root, the herb, and I don't dislike it. It is very effective at what it does in the early stages. Helps sensitize the insulin receptors on cells so that the cells can keep the blood sugar levels at a lower level and getting it back into the cells, because the first stage tends to be insulin resistance. The only problem we have is that if you take metformin for too long, it does come with a few side effects, and directly from the MIMS, which is what all the drugs are. Precautions, long-term use. I.e. stop being diabetic. Multiple medications. You've got to monitor B12, and that's one that we see people like King start losing their B12 for some reason, not real good. You can have cardiovascular function illnesses and malnourishment, especially in prepubescent children. That would be those young children that are overweight they're trying to deal with. Adverse reactions, gastrointestinal upset, raised liver function tests, hepatitis, that's bad, B12 depletion, erythema, so red skin, pruritus, itchy skin. They're probably not so good. Okay. You want to help overweight children? Sometimes you just have to be a parent, and it's not the most rewarding job when kids are kicking and screaming and you go, just eat anything. Unfortunately, children will eat what is given to them in the real world. So if they don't get given the McDiet, if they're not allowed to have sweet foods, if the sugary drinks are taken away, it's going to make it a lot easier for them to have too much in the way of sugary drinks and sweet foods. We really have to be a lot tougher with what is served up to our children, what's on their plates and what they put in their mouth. And this even comes down to stuff like some of the health recommendations, like have plenty of bread. Bread is a very high energy food. You might think that, oh, chips aren't so bad because they're based on potatoes. Potatoes, again, very high energy food because they're full of starch. Starch is just another word for sugar, by the way, just a different type. We consume way too much of this stuff in the normal diet. We'll consume it as breads, bread rolls, biscuits, pastas come into there, and our favourite of potatoes served at most meals, or chips. If we could dramatically reduce the amount of this stuff that is going into children, get them active, get away from the Xbox, iPads and all that other stuff, get them out there running around again like children used to do in long days gone by, we'll probably find a lot of these issues will help to resolve themselves. But currently, too much time inside, not enough activity, and way too many high energy foods is contributing to this. And with those poor children that are developing with a way higher body weight than what they should, that puts a lot more strain on their developing joints as well. And that's why we're seeing young kids that are walking around with back issues, hip problems, ankle issues, knee issues, because 4 times the weight is the extra strain that goes in that joint. So putting it simply, for every extra 1 kilo, it's an extra 4 kilos of stress on that joint. So if a child should be 30 kilos and they're 60, that's putting a lot of effort. So basically, let's say 240 kilos worth of strain on their joints, and they're just not made for it. So positive parenting, no child is born with the deficiency of metformin. Let's just try to keep the sugars and that to a minimum. Okay, final story for the day. Gluten intolerance. Is it a fact? Is it a fad? Or is it fiction? Well, according to some, maybe it's a little bit of both. According to the article, apparently 1 in 4 Australians are reporting that they're avoiding wheat or gluten, and I don't have a problem with that at all. Apparently, according to Dr. Michael Potter from the University of Newcastle, about only 1% of the population have celiac disease. Unfortunately, the Celiac Society of Australia say it's about 1.4%, with 80% undiagnosed. So in my maths that are clearly not very good today, That would be 1 in 5 that they have identified at 1.4%. Multiply that, carry that over. 5.6% of the population. So 1 in 18. And that's based on figures published in August 2019. 1 in 18 Australians actually could be celiacs. And the majority of them are undiagnosed. And that's celiac disease. That is not non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So I've seen plenty of people that they don't do well on wheat at all, and when I get sensitivity testing done, 99.5% of people come back that they're better avoiding wheat-based products, so the breads, the pastas. Yeah, so I'm not surprised we've got 1 in 4 people avoiding wheat. We'll probably all do a lot better. I have a very low gluten diet myself. I find if I eat gluten for a couple of days I start feeling off, and classic case, have the sandwich, half an hour later going, and I'm hungry again, because it just, white bread doesn't do anything for you. Most breads don't do much for you. Anyway, they said that there was a study of more than 1,000 people and found that those avoiding gluten had symptoms of other gastrointestinal disorders like irritable bowel, and were subjecting themselves unnecessarily to the gluten-free diet. Well, anyone who's had those early stages of celiac disease before they were diagnosed, it's a lot like irritable bowel. You have that wheat and you are very unhappy with the bloating and the diarrhea and the belching. Not a fun day. It doesn't make you a great person to be around either. One of the interesting things that they said, another Professor Gibson, I don't know where he came from, he tested colleagues and 59 other people with non-celiac gluten sensitivity for their reaction to glutens, fructans and a placebo, and they used muesli bars. And he said while gluten and placebo produce symptoms, fructans introduce symptoms the most. And to go on, the professor said this study gave the evidence that gluten is not the cause in the vast majority of self-reported non-celiac gluten intolerance. The fructans in the wheat are. Well, in Australia, pretty well gluten-free means wheat-free. You know, in other countries they do have gluten-free wheat. That's got to be heavily refined to get there. So if you were going on a gluten-free diet, that means you're not going to be having any wheat-derived products, which means you're not going to have any of those fructans anyway. So Professor Gibson, I'm afraid that those smart people that are out there avoiding gluten and wheat-based products as much as they possibly can are going to get benefits from it. It's not just one thing. There is no food that consists of just one thing. We know everything's got multiple vitamins, different amounts of fibre, phytochemicals, etc. So trying to isolate just one constituent of food, it really is a bit of craziness. Something else that we do know with all the wheat and wheat-based products is that, again, when we look at these tests, a lot of people are okay when we test them for wheat as wheat, the grain. Even as wheat flour, it's when it becomes the wheat end products is where we start seeing all of these problems. So in simple terms, look, I brought props. I don't know how this will come up. When we apply heat to something, we are dramatically changing the chemical structure of the enzymes. So just like Mrs. Marsh used to put chalk in blue stuff, let's see. See what happens when a bit of heat was applied to that cotton. It twisted, it contorted, it contracted down. So the enzymes that we would use to unlock the chemicals, when those enzymes are damaged because of the heat, we're not going to, or even the chemicals are damaged by heat too, we're not going to be able to digest them very well. And this, I believe, is one of the underlying problems we see with so many people having food sensitivities. So normal wheat is fine. When you see wheat Bix, it doesn't look a bit like regular wheat. You know, it's this rectangular shaped thing, whereas regular wheat, it's this fine, grainy sort of stuff. We also know that modern wheat has been bred for yield. So stuff like spelt or the original wheats, most people don't do so badly on those, but the modern wheats and refined wheat products is where it all comes a cropper. So keep that one in mind. Look, personally, go to a low wheat, low gluten diet. I think you'll just do better for it. Most people do. And there we go. Hopefully we might have been able to provide you with a little bit of guidance, support, help you out, help your family, help your friends out. Because that's what it's all about. be talking soon about the difference between our lifespan and our health span. We're living long lives, but we're not living healthier lives. So maybe I can help you out a little bit there. So until next week, be kind to a stranger, because one day that stranger just might be you.